Master Sergeant Lyle Pruitt picked up Sergeant First Class Venn's deployment file, looked at it for 3 seconds, and dropped it in the trash can beside his desk. Not the recycling bin. The actual trash, on top of a coffee cup and a granola bar wrapper. He looked at the 2 men standing behind him and said, loud enough for the entire ready room to hear, "Headquarters sent us a remedial case and called it a gift." Venn stood in the doorway. She had been in that doorway for 11 seconds at that point, long enough to see everything, long enough to understand exactly what kind of place she had just arrived at. She reached past Pruitt, picked her file out of the trash, tucked it under her arm, and walked to the far side of the room to find her bunk. Nobody said anything. That silence was the first data point. She had been collecting data points for 11 years. The firebase sat at the edge of a plateau in northern Iraq, 32 kilometers from the nearest paved road, surrounded by terrain that had strong opinions about vehicles and no patience for the unprepared. It was the kind of outpost that existed because someone, somewhere, had decided that a particular stretch of ridgeline needed eyes on it continuously and had subsequently stopped thinking very hard about the people assigned to provide those eyes. 3rd Reconnaissance was not a glamorous unit, it was a functional one, which was its own kind of distinction. 12 men, 2 vehicles, a radio system that worked approximately 80% of the time, and a collective opinion of their new temporary attachment that they had formed before she finished unpacking. Pruitt was 41, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been serious so long it had forgotten how to be anything else. He had 2 Bronze Stars and a reputation for running missions clean, which meant he ran them the way he had always run them. Without adjustment, without consultation, without what he called unnecessary variables. He used that phrase, unnecessary variables, with a specific precision that revealed what he actually meant. He meant people who were different from the people he already understood. He meant Venn. She was 31. She had been a reconnaissance specialist for 9 years and a markswoman for 11. Since the summer, her father had handed her a rifle at a range in West Texas and told her that the most important thing he could teach her had nothing to do with shooting. It had to do with what you did with your breath in the moment before. She had not forgotten that. Corporal Yates was the one who brought her the unit brief that evening. He was 23, with ears that were slightly too large for his head, and the specific efficiency of someone who had learned that delivering information quickly was the best way to avoid being part of whatever the information caused. He set the folder on the footlocker beside her bunk and started to leave. "Yates," she said. He stopped. "Pruitt request this unit or get assigned?" Yates looked at the wall directly above her head. "Assigned, Sergeant? And me?" "Request came from group. Nobody here put in for it. I know." She opened the folder. "That'll do," he left, she read. The mission was standard reconnaissance, forward observation, route security for a logistic convoy, moving through the Cullen Corridor in 6 days. The corridor itself was 47 kilometers of road that ran through a series of valley cuts and ridge crossings that somebody at some level had assessed as moderate risk. She had read the words moderate risk in enough briefing documents to understand that they covered a significant range of actual conditions, from genuinely moderate to catastrophically misread. She set the folder down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook and started writing. The next morning, Pruitt ran her through what he called an integration assessment, which was a phrase that meant something specific in the manual and something slightly different in practice. In practice, it meant standing at the base of the eastern ridge in 40-degree wind and watching her perform a series of timed tasks that had nothing to do with the actual mission while his 2 senior NCOs, Staff Sergeant Orrin Graber and Sergeant Mac Tully, stood to the side and consulted each other quietly. She performed every task. She performed them correctly, and she performed them fast, not because she was trying to impress anyone, though she understood that was how it would be read, but because she had learned a long time ago that the only language that certain people could hear was the language of results, and even that language had to be spoken very clearly and more than once before they started listening. "Navigation run," Pruitt said when she finished the last task. "Grid to grid. I'll give you 1 deviation. What's the time on it?" he told her. She completed it 4 minutes faster than the time he gave her, using a route deviation he hadn't anticipated, which brought her back to the start point from a direction that surprised the 2 men watching. She stood in front of Pruitt and waited. He looked at his watch. He looked at the direction she had come from. He said nothing for a moment. Tomorrow. Range qualification, he said. I'm already qualify again here. She understood the subtext. She nodded once and walked back toward the firebase. Behind her, she heard Graber say something she couldn't quite catch. She heard Pruitt's response clearly. Doesn't change anything. She filed that away too. The range was set up on the flat ground below the western cliff face. Wind from the north, variable cold, in the way that cut without announcing itself, 6 targets at increasing distances. The whole unit had turned out, which told her what she needed to know about their expectations. She had learned to read the way people position themselves at moments like this. The men who expected her to fail stood where they could see her face when things went wrong. The men who were genuinely neutral stood where they could see the targets. Yates was the only one who stood where he could see both, which told her something about Yates. She set up her position without hurrying. The ritual was not for them. The ritual was hers, built over 9 years into something that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the specific act of becoming still at the right moment. Her father had called it finding the pause. He had a lot of phrases like that, quiet and functional. The phrases of a man who believed that the truth about most things could be said plainly if you chose the right words. She missed him in a specific way that she had learned over 4 years to carry without letting it interfere with the work. It was its own kind of discipline. First target 300 meters. Center, second target 500. Center. The murmurs from the assembled unit changed tone slightly at the second hit. The way murmurs do when people have come expecting one thing and are receiving another and haven't yet decided what to do with the difference. 700 meters. The wind gusted across the range in a hard lateral push. She had been reading the wind for 40 minutes from the moment she arrived and knew exactly what that gust was before it arrived, had built it into her calculation before she settled into her cheek weld. The round hit center. The murmurs went quiet. 850 meters. She read the wind for 90 seconds, not the wind on the range surface, but the behavior of air along the entire path, the way it changed elevation at 400 meters and did something slightly different near the target than it did at mid-range. She calculated, she adjusted, she breathed out, the target fell. Complete silence from the unit. Then, from somewhere at the back, one person began to clap. She would not know until later that it was Yates, and that he had started it fully aware that no one else would join immediately, and had kept clapping until 2 others did. Pruitt did not clap. When she turned to break down her position, he was already walking back toward the firebase. He had left before the last shot. She noted that evening, Yates found her on the western perimeter, watching the light change on the ridge above the colonne corridor. You could make it easier on yourself, he said. He had a direct quality that was unusual in someone his age and rank, the quality of someone who had decided early that the energy required for indirection was energy wasted. With Pruitt, what would I change? He thought about it. Nothing, I guess. Then what exactly are you suggesting I make easier? He stood with that for a moment. The wind moved across the perimeter and sent dust past their boots in thin horizontal sheets. What happened at your last unit? He asked. If you can say. She looked at the ridge for a long moment. Bad intelligence, she said. Mission planning that used data someone had already flagged as unreliable, and the flag got buried. 2 people got hurt who didn't have to. Yates absorbed this. And you flagged it? And I was told the assessment had already been reviewed. By who? She turned to look at him for the first time since he'd arrived. By the person who buried the flag. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is that why you're here? She looked back at the corridor. The light was going copper at the ridge edges, the specific color of late afternoon in this kind of terrain, the color that turned details visible that the flat white of midday had obscured. Get some rest, she said. Something in this valley has been too quiet for too long. He looked at the ridge, trying to see what she saw. How can you tell? No traffic on the lower road for 4 days. Wind behavior off the north face is wrong. And yesterday morning there were no birds in the upper canyon. Birds, movement suppresses them. The absence means something is holding still up there. Something that knows how to hold still. She paused. That's not good. He looked at the ridge for another moment. Then he walked back toward the fire base, and she stood there alone in the changing light, watching the canyon and writing notes in her head that she would transfer to paper when she got back to her bunk. The way she had been doing for 9 years. The way her father had taught her to externalize observation before sleep dissolved it. Her father. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside pocket of her jacket, where a worn photograph had lived through 3 deployments without being taken out more than necessary, because the act of taking it out was something she rationed carefully, the way you rationed anything that mattered. Not yet. 3 days before the convoy was scheduled to move, she went to find Captain Sandra Heck, the company commander, at 7 in the morning. Heck was 44 small, with close-cropped hair and the specific economy of movement that came from a career spent in spaces where unnecessary motion was a liability. She listened without interruption for 6 minutes while Venn laid out her observations. The bird behavior, the wind, the road traffic patterns, the 3 positions on the North Ridge she had identified through 4 days of careful observation as consistent with prepared fighting positions. When Venn finished, Heck was quiet for a moment. Pruitt's intelligence assessment has the corridor at moderate risk. I know. You're telling me moderate is wrong. I'm telling you the terrain is showing characteristic consistent with an ambush setup. I can't confirm without access to those ridgelines. She held Heck's gaze. But if I were going to ambush a convoy in this corridor, those are exactly the positions I would use. And I'm very good at setting ambushes. Heck looked at her steadily. The convoy can't delay. The resupply window at the forward clinic closes in 4 days. After that, 6 weeks minimum before the road's passable again. I know. How many people in the clinic service area? About 400, mostly rural, elderly population. Then we go. Heck leaned back slightly. But I want you on the ridgeline before the convoy enters the corridor. Independent overwatch. Can you do the eastern approach alone? Yes. How long do you need? 30-minute head start. I'll take the service road to the cliff base, then go up. Heck nodded slowly. There's something else, she said. Pruitt's reassessment request. He put in paperwork 3 days ago to have you reassigned out of the unit before the convoy mission. She paused. I denied it. I want you to know that. Why are you telling me? Heck looked at her directly. Because I want you to know who's watching your back before you go up a ridge alone. She stood up. 30-minute head start. Go. Venn turned to leave. Then, she stopped. Pruitt's assessment didn't come from nothing. There's a source I can't discuss at your clearance level. But there's a reason I'm sending you up that ridge instead of trusting the assessment. She met Venn's eyes. Don't let me be wrong. Venn walked out into the cold. She heard Pruitt talking to Graber near the vehicle bay 20 minutes later, loading up for convoy prep. She caught 2 phrases over the sound of the engine running. The first was already covered. The second was tell him, it goes ahead. She stopped walking. She did not turn around. She stood completely still and let her hearing do what it had been trained to do, narrowing the ambient noise the way a scope narrowed distance. But the engine was too loud and the distance too great, and she caught nothing else. Already covered. Tell him it goes ahead. She walked to the equipment bay and put on her gear with hands that were steady, not because she wasn't calculating, but because calculation and steadiness were not opposites in her experience. They had been the same thing since her father had first shown her what it meant to prepare before the moment asked you to. She thought about the file she had read at group headquarters 8 months ago, the one that had initially sent her toward this theater, toward this particular unit, toward a series of coincidences that she had begun to understand were not coincidences. A compromised route, a suppressed flag, a logistics officer whose name appeared twice in documents connected to incidents in this corridor over the past 2 years. She had not come to 3rd reconnaissance by accident. She shouldered her pack. She walked out into the pre-dawn dark. Yates was at the gate. I'm going with you to the start point, he said. I don't need an escort, I know. He fell into step beside her. Then, she slowed fractionally. 20 minutes ago, I was running a comm check on the backup frequency, channel 9. He kept his voice low and even. I picked up traffic, not one of ours. She stopped walking. She turned to look at him fully. His face was serious in the way that young faces are serious when they have just received information that has reordered everything around them. Encrypted, but our system flagged the signal pattern. It matched a known network signature from the regional threat library. He held her gaze. The transmission originated from inside the wire. The pre-dawn dark was complete around them. The firebase sounds continued. Vehicles, radio traffic, the generator, normal, did you report it? Went to find Captain Heck. She was with Pruitt. His jaw tightened slightly. I couldn't say it in front of him. Venn stood completely still. The picture that had been assembling itself over 4 days completed itself in that moment with the specific clarity of something that had been true all along and was only now fully visible. The suppressed assessment. The Channel 9 transmission from inside the wire. Already covered, tell him it goes ahead. She had read a file 8 months ago about a logistics chain that had been feeding position data to a network operating in this corridor for 3 years. The file named a pattern. It did not name a person, but it described the behavior of someone embedded at the coordination level. Someone with access to convoy routes and timing, someone who had been providing that access in increments small enough to survive scrutiny. She looked at Yates. Find Heck when Pruitt is not with her. Tell her exactly what you heard. Channel 9, signal pattern, inside the wire origin. And you? She looked at the ridge, dark, against a sky that was just beginning to separate itself from night. I'm going up, she said. Venn. His voice was quiet and certain. Be careful, she almost said something dismissive. She had a long habit of deflecting care with efficiency, treating concern as a logistical problem to be resolved rather than a human thing to be acknowledged. But she looked at his face and saw something in it that was not worry about her capability. It was worry about her. The specific worry of someone who had been paying attention. You too, she said. She walked toward the mountain. She had been climbing for 18 minutes when the first explosion hit. The concussion traveled through the rock before the sound did, a deep physical fact that arrived in her chest like a fist. Then the sound rolled up the slope in a wave that shook loose dust from the ledge above her and rattled small stones past her boots. She did not stop climbing. She needed 3 more minutes to reach the shelf she had identified from the map, a narrow rock platform at 900 meters with a clean line of sight down the entire corridor floor. 3 minutes was 3 minutes. Stopping now helped no one below. Reaching position would. She climbed faster. Her radio came alive with the overlapping voices of a unit that had just been hit. She heard Heck's voice cutting through it, calm and sharp, the voice of a commanding officer spending exactly the training she had accumulated, not saving any of it. All elements contact west. Take cover. Identify firing positions. Overwatch report. Overwatch not yet in position, she said without slowing. 90 seconds. Copy. Move. She moved. The shelf was exactly where she had calculated. She pulled herself onto it, deployed in 11 seconds and put her eye to her scope. The corridor below her was a different kind of problem than the one she had been solving on the way up. The convoy's lead vehicle was burning. The second vehicle had been stopped by the blast and was taking fire from 2 elevations simultaneously. Not reactive fire. Coordinated overlapping fire from prepared positions with the professional quality of an ambush that had been planned in detail and was executing as designed. 4 men down. 2 more moving wrong, the dragging movement of people who were hit and still fighting. She found the first position in 5 seconds. West Ridge, 400 meters from her, 600 from the convoy. She fired. The incoming from that position stopped. Contact West Ridge, she said into her radio. 1 position cleared, engaging. She was already moving her scope. 2nd position, East Ridge, higher elevation than she had estimated from the ground, positioned to create crossfire that eliminated the obvious cover options for the convoy. She found it from impact pattern, tracked the trajectory, confirmed the position, fired. 2 down. The radio shifted tone below her, the specific change that occurred when men who were completely pinned began to believe the pin might lift. She worked the scope across the corridor. 3rd position, east face lower, using a ground fold that had appeared on her map as a probable location, but that she had not been able to confirm from observation. She confirmed it now from the muzzle signature. 2 rounds, 4 seconds. The automatic fire from that position stopped. 3 down. The ambush was not over, but it had changed. The coordinated quality of it was fraying at the edges, the way a structure frays when you remove the load-bearing elements. The remaining fire was more cautious, less certain. They knew there was a counter position. They didn't know where she was. She kept moving her scope. She found the 4th position and cleared it and heard Yates's voice on the radio, steady and deliberate, calling corrections for the Marines below that told her he could see the north face, but not the east, that he was doing what he could with what he had. 4 down. She pulled back from her scope for 3 full seconds, which was counterintuitive, which was why she did it. When you could not find something by looking at the pieces, you looked at the whole. The remaining fire was precise, selection of targets, not volume, cutting off specific retreat lines, maintaining the pin with minimum rounds. She knew this pattern. It was her pattern. It was the pattern of a trained shooter who understood that 1 accurate round in the right place was worth 30 rounds fired fast. She looked at the whole corridor and traced the logic of the fire backward. There was a formation on the north face that she had noted from the ground and dismissed as a likely position because the approach from the firebase side was exposed and steep. But from the other side, from the network's own access, it was protected and natural, sitting at a distance from her current position of approximately 1,000 meters. She keyed her radio, 5th position, north face, behind the primary formation at grid. She gave the coordinates. Approximately 1,000 meters from my position. Recommend all personnel maintain cover until I clear it. Heck's response was immediate. Copy Overwatch. Confidence? High. She looked at the wind. The temperature had dropped 3 degrees since she had reached the shelf. Give me 5 minutes. 4, Heck said. I have 2 people who need a medical evacuation in 4 minutes. Understood. She clicked off the radio and breathed. This was the part that could not be explained to someone who had not done it. The part that existed entirely in the space between preparation and execution, where everything you had ever done in the quiet, unglamorous accumulation of a career was either there or it wasn't. Her father had told her once, sitting on the back step of their house in West Texas, while the sky went from orange to purple, and the first insects started in the grass, that the difference between being good at something and being able to do it when it mattered was not talent. Talent was the starting point. What closed the distance was all the time you spent when nobody was grading you, when there was no performance and no audience, and the only thing watching you work was the work itself. She had spent 11 years working when nobody was watching. She thought about him not in the way of grief, though grief was there, had always been there. The specific grief of a daughter who had watched her father's name reduced to a statistic in a department report through a failure of process that she had spent 4 years trying to understand and 8 months trying to trace to its source. She thought about him the way she thought about him when she needed something she couldn't manufacture, the specific presence of a person who had believed in her capacity before she had earned it and had been right. She stopped fighting the shelf angle and worked with it. She stopped fighting the cold in her hands and let them settle into the numbness that was actually more stable than warmth. She read the wind. At her position, manageable. At the target position, 1,000 meters out on the exposed north face, the wind was doing something curved, wrapping around the rock formation in a rotating pattern that she could read from the dust behavior at 3 reference points along the line. The rotation cycled every 10 seconds. At the peak of each cycle, a 2-second window where the wind was close to axis and the drift correction was minimal. She timed 6 cycles. She confirmed the pattern. She calculated the elevation drop, the air density, the slope correction. She waited for the rotation, 8 seconds, 9. The dust at the base of the north formation moved in a specific way she had been watching for. She fired. She watched through her scope for 4 seconds that felt like something else entirely. The fire from the north face stopped, completely, finally. She lay still for 20 seconds. Then she keyed her radio. 5th position cleared. Corridor is clean. You can move. A pause. Then Heck's voice, carrying something underneath the professional language that Heck probably did not know, was audible. Copy Overwatch. Good work. Come down. She was halfway down the mountain when her secondary radio activated on channel 9. A brief encoded transmission, 12 seconds. She listened to it resolve and understood what she was hearing. A status report from inside the firebase. A confirmation that the ambush had failed. A request for instructions. She stopped on the ledge with one hand on the rock face. The 5th shooter, the one at 1,000 meters, had not been the network's primary. He had been the field element, the person who had designed this operation, who had provided the timing, the convoy route, the gap in the Overwatch coverage, was still in the firebase, was still transmitting, was standing somewhere in the firebase right now, in a United States Army uniform, filing a report that told someone in a building she had never seen that the operation had failed. She started moving down faster than she had come up. She hit the firebase at a pace that was not quite running, which meant she was running. Heck was outside the command post, talking to the convoy medical coordinator, and saw her coming from 40 meters out and said something brief to the coordinator and moved toward her. You heard the Channel 9 traffic, Heck said. It was not a question. On the way down, Venn stopped. You know about it. I've known for 2 months. Heck's voice had a specific flatness, the flatness of someone who had been carrying something alone for a long time and was now in the part where it mattered whether the carrying had been worth it. I needed more than a signal pattern. I needed something that couldn't be explained as equipment error or atmospheric interference. She paused. I needed today. Venn looked at her steadily. How many operations in 2 months? Heck's jaw tightened. 2. Both soft compromised, small enough to absorb without triggering a formal investigation. She looked away for a moment. Today was going to be different. Today was going to be too large to attribute to bad luck. He didn't know I was going to be on that ridge. He requested Overwatch go to someone else, someone who was at a medical appointment. Venn understood the full shape of it. The 2 months of patient management, the careful construction of a case, the decision to let the convoy proceed because it was the only thing that would produce something solid enough to hold. He's in the firebase right now, she said. Pruitt is in the vehicle bay. He transmitted after the 5th position went down. Whoever he reports to doesn't know the full scope of what happened yet. There's a window to trace the recipient. She reached into her pack and put a small device on Heck's palm. I've been carrying this for 8 months. It can triangulate encrypted transmissions at the source within 60 meters. If he transmits again in the next 20 minutes, I can get you a coordinate. Heck looked at the device. She looked at Venn. You came here for this. I came here because a logistics officer's name appeared in 2 different incident files from this corridor over 3 years. And the first file had a footnote that connected back to a department report that named my father. Venn held her gaze. My father was an Army intelligence analyst. He identified this network's corridor access 14 years ago. The report was buried. 18 months later, he died in an accident that the official investigation found inconclusive. Heck was quiet for a moment. How long have you known? 4 years. I read the file the day they declassified it. I've been building a case since then and waiting for an assignment that would get me close enough to the source. You should have told me? I couldn't tell you until I had something solid enough that you couldn't talk me out of it. She met Heck's eyes. Can I go back up? Heck looked at her for a long moment. You have 20 minutes before the medical evacuation birds arrive, and I need everyone accounted for. She closed her fingers around the device. 20 minutes. After that, I cannot account for your position. She looked away. Go, Venn was already moving. The second ascent was harder in every physical sense. Her legs knew what they had already done and were conducting a running argument with the rest of her about what they were being asked to do again. She climbed anyway, not fast enough to risk noise on the approach, fast enough that the 20 minutes would hold. She reached the shelf in 16 minutes. She deployed the triangulation receiver and settled into the cold and waited. Below her, the firebase reorganized itself around the aftermath of the morning. She could see Yates moving between the vehicles with the focused purpose of someone who had found a role in the chaos and was performing it without asking for instruction. She could see Heck at the command post, managing the evacuation coordination, talking into her radio with the specific posture of someone who was also managing something else underneath the official conversation. She could see Pruitt. He was at the north end of the vehicle bay, oriented toward the firebase wall, with the stillness of a man who was waiting for something. Not the vigilant stillness of a soldier in a post-contact environment, the concealment stillness of someone who needed privacy. 11 minutes passed. At minute 13, the receiver activated. The transmission lasted 19 seconds. She watched the coordinates resolve on the small display with the unhurried precision of a piece of equipment performing exactly its designed function. She looked at the coordinates. She looked at them again. The source was not in Iraq. It was in a building in Amman, Jordan, in a facility she recognized from the declassified portion of her father's original report. The facility connected to the network he had identified 14 years ago, the one whose access to this corridor he had documented in the report that had been buried 3 weeks before his death. She had the trace. She secured the receiver. She sat on the shelf for 60 seconds and did something she had not done in 4 years, not since the night she had read the declassified file and understood what her father's death had actually been. She let herself feel it, not the grief, which was always there, which had never left, the specific weight of what the grief had become over 4 years, the way it had been converted through choice and discipline, and the accumulation of quiet work into something that pointed forward instead of inward. Her father had taught her that the most important moment in any engagement was the moment of stillness before the shot. He had taught her that stillness was not the absence of preparation. It was preparation made complete. She had been preparing for 4 years. She stood up and began the descent. She was 20 meters from the firebase when Yates's voice came through her radio. Venn, Pruitt is moving. North perimeter toward the maintenance road. His voice was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling it deliberately. The two people Heck had watching him, he made them. He's running. She stopped walking. She calculated the north perimeter, the maintenance road, the terrain beyond it. If Pruitt reached the drainage cut that ran along the north side of the plateau, he had 4 kilometers of covered ground before it opened into territory where vehicle extraction was possible. Are you tracking him? Visual. He's moving fast. He knows the terrain. Stay visual. Do not close. Venn. A pause. He's going to reach the drainage in 2 minutes. I know. She was already moving, not toward the perimeter gate but toward the eastern vehicle track, which ran parallel to the north perimeter at a higher elevation and would put her above the drainage cut in approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes was the calculation. She ran the calculation and she ran. She heard Yates's breathing on the radio, steady and tracking. She heard him give 2 position updates. She heard the moment when his voice shifted slightly and she knew before he said it. He heard me. He knows someone's following. He's in the cut. Hold your position. Then, if he reaches the hold, I have an angle. She reached the vehicle track, took the elevation, moved along the ridge above the drainage cut until the geometry resolved in her favor and went prone on the edge. She looked through her scope into the cut below. She found him in 3 seconds, moving fast and low, a man who had trained for exactly this contingency, whose preparation for this moment was as real and specific as hers for the moment on the shelf. He had a radio in his left hand. He was trying to transmit. She was 60 meters above him. She had a clean shot. She did not take it. Not because she couldn't, because a dead Pruitt was an ended conversation. Because what she had on the triangulation receiver, combined with whatever Yates had heard on Channel 9 and whatever 2 months of Hex's careful documentation contained, was a door that opened onto every room this network had been operating in. She needed him to be the key, not the lock. Pruitt, she said. He stopped. The specific quality of his stillness in that moment was different from the concealment stillness she had watched from the shelf. This was the stillness of a man who had just understood that he had been anticipated, not caught, anticipated. There was a difference, and he was good enough at his work to feel it. Set the radio down, she said. And your weapon. A long pause. She watched his hands through the scope. It doesn't have to be. The radio, Pruitt, and the weapon. He made the calculations she had watched him make in other forms all week. She watched it resolve in his posture before his hands moved. When they moved slowly, and the radio hit the floor of the cut, and the weapon came off his shoulder, and he stood with his hands away from his body. Who sent you? He said. It was not quite a question. Nobody sent me. She kept her voice level. I found you. There's a difference. He stood with his hands up and said nothing. She watched him through her scope and waited. 4 minutes later, Yates arrived from the south end of the cut with his rifle up and zip ties on his belt and hands that were shaking slightly from the specific adrenaline of a 23-year-old who had just spent 30 minutes understanding in real time what betrayal actually cost. He placed Pruitt in restraints and said nothing the entire time, which told her more about Yates than anything she had observed in the previous 6 days. When Heck arrived, she looked at Pruitt in the drainage cut, and then she looked up at Venn on the ridge above, still prone, still holding her rifle. She said nothing for a moment. Then did you get it? Venn held up the receiver. Heck looked at it. She looked at the ground for 1 second. Then she looked back up. Good, she said. Just that. The debrief lasted 6 hours. A 2-person CD team had arrived by the second helicopter, which told her that Heck had been making calls since before the convoy departed. The case had been in motion longer than Venn had known. One of the agents, a man named Atchison, who had the specific physical economy of someone who had been doing careful work for a long time and had shed everything unnecessary from the way he moved and spoke, looked at her at one point and said, "The triangulation equipment, you carried it without authorization for 8 months. I did. You understand there will be a review board. I do." He wrote something. "You decided the outcome was worth the process. I decided 4 years ago," she said. "I just didn't know exactly what I was deciding toward until today." He looked at her for a moment, then he moved on. It was close to midnight when Heck found her in the hallway outside the debrief room, standing with a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour. "The Amman coordinates," Heck said. "Our people confirmed the facility identity this afternoon. They're moving on it through liaison channels." She paused. "Your father's report." The original one. The network it described has been operational for 14 years. There are 4 other cases across 3 countries that connect to the same source. Venn absorbed this. 4 other cases, other names, other families, other people who had carried the specific weight of loss without knowing what had caused it. He wasn't the only one, she said. No. Heck was quiet for a moment. But the trace you brought back today closes all 4 cases, not just his. Venn looked at the wall. She thought about her father at a range in West Texas, the way he had explained the breath before the shot. She thought about how long she had been holding her breath. The unit, she said. The wounded, 3 men from the convoy, all stable. Colonel, one is going to have a long recovery, but will recover. Venn was quiet. Venn. Heck turned to look at her directly. You know what that ambush looked like with no overwatch. You know the numbers. 5 coordinated positions in that terrain. She held Venn's gaze. You know what today was without you on that ridge. She knew. She had done the math from the moment she reached position that morning. Get some sleep, Heck said. Board review in 72 hours. I've already submitted my statement. She paused at the end of the hallway. It's comprehensive. She went to her bunk. She sat on it without taking off her jacket. She reached into the inside pocket and took out the photograph. Her father in his dress uniform, the one he had worn to her commissioning ceremony, standing with the specific posture of a man who took seriously the things he had decided were worth taking seriously. He was not smiling in the photograph. He had a quality when things mattered of not filling the space with expression that he didn't actually feel, which was something she had inherited without knowing she was inheriting it. She looked at the photograph for a long time, the debt she had been carrying for 4 years, the specific debt of a daughter who had read a file in a gray room and understood that her father's death had been chosen by someone, not caused by circumstance, and who had then faced the question of what to do with that understanding. She had answered it the only way that made sense to her, the way he had always answered hard questions, with patience and preparation, and the willingness to do the work when nobody was watching. The debt was paid, not erased. Paid. There was a knock at the door. She recognized the specific quality of it before she said anything. Come in, Yates. He opened the door. He was in off-duty clothes, his expression carrying the specific combination of exhaustion and unresolved alertness that came from a day that had been too large to process in a single sleep cycle. He stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph on the footlocker. He did not ask about it. Graber came to find me an hour ago, he said, and Tully, separately. He paused. They wanted me to tell you something. She waited. They said they knew something was off. About Pruitt, about the valley. They didn't know what it was, but they knew something was wrong, and they didn't push it. He held her gaze. They wanted me to say they were sorry for that. She was quiet for a moment. Tell them, she said, that what they owe isn't to me. 3 men are in the medical facility right now. Those are the people they owe. Go see them, do their laundry, write to their families. She paused. That's how you pay a debt like this. Not with an apology, with action. Yates looked at her for a moment. Your father, he said quietly, you did this for him. I did it for the truth, she said. He just needed someone to find it. Yates nodded once. He started to pull the door shut. Yates! He stopped. The drainage cut, thank you for staying visual and not closing with him. I thought about closing, he said. I know. Thank you for thinking about it and not doing it anyway. He almost smiled. He closed the door. She sat alone. The firebase sounds continued around her, the normal sounds of a functioning place that had survived an abnormal day and was restoring itself to routine. She picked up her field notebook and opened it to the last page she had written on. The final line, written in the pre-dawn dark before she had gone up the ridge the first time, read, Dad, I think I'm close. Below it, she wrote 3 words. She looked at them. Then she closed the notebook and put the photograph back in her jacket pocket, against her chest, where it had lived through 4 years and 3 deployments and 1 day in a corridor in northern Iraq. Outside, the morning was arriving in the slow gray way of mornings in this part of the world, the dark thinning by degrees until there was just enough light to see by. She put on her jacket. She walked out to the eastern perimeter. The ridge was there. The sun was coming up behind it, gold at the upper edges, throwing light across the rock faces and the snow patches and the specific indifferent terrain of a valley that had held its breath for days and finally exhaled. She stood on the perimeter and looked at it. She thought about the shot at 1,000 meters. She thought about her father's voice, saying that the battlefield was not something you fought. It was something you read. When you read it well enough, The shot wasn't the end of a struggle. It was the natural conclusion of a conversation you had been having with the world around you. She had been having that conversation for 4 years. It had landed true. The light came across the ridge and fell on everything below it, without distinction, without preference, illuminating the valley and the firebase, and the burnt-out vehicle still sitting at the corridor entrance and the mountains beyond it with the same impartial clarity. It didn't grade what it showed, it only showed it. She reached into her pocket and pressed 2 fingers against the photograph. She didn't take it out. She just held it there for a moment, in the morning light, in the cold, in the specific quiet of something finished. Then she took her hand away and stood up straight and breathed the air of a place that had tried to take something from her and had not succeeded.